couple days ago I posted this clip. In this video I'll explain what the heck you're looking at and get into some big numbers and fast-growing functions, but let's start smaller. Is this a big number? Do you recognize it? What about this? Now I'm going to ask a very easy question. Which one of these numbers is bigger? It's the second one, and you didn't need to read all the digits to be able to answer that. I could swap a pair of digits in the middle and you probably wouldn't notice, and it wouldn't matter. It would still be the bigger of the two numbers, and it isn't close. Soon we're going to be talking about Graham's number, which is a big number. Way too big to be written out as a string of digits. Because of this, I want you to be ready to reimagine how we know one number is bigger than another. In this case, we count the digits, but it's not always that simple. Now, for what these numbers are, the bigger one, with all its digits in the proper order, is 2 to the power of 53. It's kind of famous on this channel. The smaller one, well, that's my playtime in hours for the game Opus Magnum. I'm pretty committed. I've made many cool things. Right now I want to show you a machine that I built in Opus Magnum with a cycle score much bigger than Graham's number. Let's give a quick rundown on what this game is and how it works. Opus Magnum comes from the studio Zachtronics, and they've made several games over the years that all have the same basic premise. You solve puzzles, you receive scores. In the world of Opus Magnum, alchemy is widespread and it happens inside of transmutation engines, which are just machines. You have to build and program these machines. When you make a machine and you get your scores, one of these scores is called cycles. It measures how many time steps have to happen before your machine has made 6 of whatever the puzzle says to make. Usually you want the cycle score to be low, that means it's fast, it's efficient. But I wanted to make something slow instead. I did it on the tutorial puzzle. Here's that puzzle. You connect 2 water atoms, you turn one of them to salt, and you drop it on the output. Here's an example solution. Let's go slower. The game gives us unlimited space. This machine still works if I move the halves apart by some distance. As I make it wider, the cycle count will go up, but how long am I willing to pan the screen to the right? Another 7,000 hours of just this? Well, no, that's boring. And more importantly, there are smarter ways to be slow. You see, over the years, we found ways to do computation in Opus Magnum. The game is designed to build looping, factory-style engines that repeat some same process forever. Because of this, every program you could possibly write is just a loop of actions. But if you do the same actions, as the space around you changes, you can stay out of infinite loops. You can make real programs. The game is Turing complete. Most examples I've seen of computation in Opus Magnum, especially Turing completeness, they're big and confusing. I tried to build something smaller and simpler, so let's load up the machine that I built, titled Kinda Slow. It solves the same puzzle, but it takes more than Graham's number cycles to do it. And all the parts fit on one screen. There is one arm, so only one part to program. Its program is 336 instructions long. We can right-click and drag to see the whole thing. There are 2 things to talk about now. What function is this little arm running, and how is it doing it? Let's start with the function. Let's look at big numbers again. Say you needed to come up with a number that is too big to write. How would you communicate it at all? You would need some notation for it besides a string of digits. Well, let's start with power towers. 3 to the 3 is 27, easy enough. What about 3 to the 3 to the 3? When reading this, you do the uppermost exponential first, so this is the same thing as 3 to the 27, and that's a 13-digit number. 7,625,597,484,987. Still writable, still can be said. What comes next is 3 to the 3 to the 3 to the 3. This number has 3.6 trillion digits. If you were really devoted, you could write it down in your lifetime. But if you go one more, 3 to the 3 to the 3 to the 3 to the 3, now using 5 threes, it's too big. Nobody can write this number, ever. There isn't enough room in the universe anyway. But we did just write it with power towers. We have something more powerful than digits, it's repeated exponentiation. There's a simple notation for this operation that uses 2 up arrows. So the most recent number we just wrote is 3, 2 arrows, 5. To evaluate this, you would write 5 threes, and then from right to left, you perform exponentiation. You might see where this is going. What about 3, 2 up arrows, 3, 2 up arrows, 3? Well, we know that second number. That's that 7 trillion number. So this is another power tower, but it is 7 trillion and more threes high. That's much bigger than 3, 2 up arrows, 5. Well, repeating 2 up arrows defines 3 up arrows. And this pattern continues. The numbers get much larger, but at this point, the actual size of the numbers has lost all meaning. These are kind of just symbols that mean big, so let's try to get some meaning back. Let's make an analogy to counting digits. Here's a section of the number line ranging from 1,000 to 9,999. All of the 4-digit numbers live in this interval. Around it, we can see other numbers of digits. If we rescale it so that these intervals all become the same width, we have a logarithmic scale. I want to make a version of this picture, but with power towers. And because I'm making the visuals, I can pick where the boundaries live. So the interval labeled 4 is now everything between 3 2 up arrows 4 and 3 2 up arrows 5. Fun fact, a googolplex lives in this interval somewhere. And this is the interval where the idea of writing the number down becomes impossible. I want to make it clear, the numbers in this region still do have a place on all scales, including the logarithmic scale, but it is so large that it's nearly meaningless. So this scale that we're on right now is more useful for those numbers. As before, we can see other intervals, and then we can rescale it so that the intervals become the same width. This is some type of log star scale, and that name isn't too important, it's more about the concept. Every number still makes it onto this picture somewhere, but this scale has better meaning for some large numbers. But it breaks eventually too. A number like 3 up arrows 3 is once again too big. We could make another scale in terms of 3 up arrows, but the obvious problem suggests that we should make something else instead. A scale that fits things with an arbitrary number of up arrows. So how about this? Both numbers are now 3, and the thing that varies is the number of up arrows. Interval 4 goes from 3 with 4 up arrows 3 to 3 with 5 up arrows 3. Squishing this down to make all of the intervals the same width brings in much bigger numbers. This scale is special. Each of the scales is actually a visual for a function in the fast-growing hierarchy. These functions all have a label that is an ordinal number, which includes all of the regular counting numbers, but also many different infinities. You can watch Vsauce's video called Counting Past Infinity for more about ordinal numbers. The smallest infinite ordinal is called omega. The scale that we just built visualizes the function f omega of n. So does Graham's number fit nicely on this scale? Well, no. We'll get there soon. What does fit nicely on this scale is the Ackermann function. The Ackermann function is a recursive function defined like this. When evaluated, it gives this. The first of the 2 inputs very closely encodes the number of up arrows in the output, meaning that as you vary that number, you move around by 1 interval at a time on the f omega scale. Changing the exponent moves you around in the logarithmic picture. Changing this argument to Ackermann moves you around in the omega picture. What's really cool about the Ackermann function is how simple it is to actually program. Because it recursively calls itself, you have to have some sort of a call stack, but that can be done by just maintaining a list of numbers. removing the first two and then putting either 1, 2, or 3 numbers back in. Then take the first two again and repeat. At every step, you are progressing the computation. Eventually, your list has only one number in it, and that's your answer. In Opus Magnum, a list 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 might look like this. But zeros are awkward. If we want this to stay connected, 0 has to be an atom too. But we never need negative values, so it's fine to just add 1 to everything, making 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 look like this instead. Now, I'm not the first person to build an Ackermann function calculator in Opus Magnum. That honor goes to Shufflepants. Please take a look at this if you want to see the OG Ackermann machine in action. However, Ackermann is just a part of what my machine is doing. To actually figure out its cycle count, we need to go even further. Let's return to our f omega scale. We will use it to define a function big F that's kind of like Ackermann but has a more convenient output. If n is the input, and the output will be 3 n up arrows 3. So if you took big F of 4, it would give you 3 4 up arrows 3, which is the start of the fourth interval in our f omega scale. We can iterate this function big F. We can look at big F of 4. The result has 3 4 up arrows 3 up arrows. This is too big for our f omega scale. The distance to the right where we would put it is one of those universe-breaking numbers. And remember, we made this scale to try to get around the problem of just repeating something a bunch of times. But it gives us a function that we can now repeat. And that defines the scale for f omega plus 1. Yeah, ordinal numbers are kind of funny. Omega plus 1 is still infinite, but it is the one that comes after omega. So let's write down the scale. The first interval starts at 4, for reasons I'll make sense of soon, and it ends at 3 4 up arrows 3. The next interval starts there and ends at 3 that many up arrows 3. We're going to need to give these names, but they have names. I'll call 4 G0, and this number G1. G1 has G0 up arrows, G2 has G1 up arrows, and so on. Now remember, every time we make a new scale and we say that the intervals are the same width, we are squishing more and more of the number line into each interval. It becomes even more extreme the further to the right we go. Well, we finally squished it enough. Graham's number is on this scale. Specifically, Graham's number is G64 with all of these definitions of 3s and 4s. What even is Graham's number? Why is it important? Well, back in 1917, Ronald Graham was working on a graph theory problem and evidently found this number as an upper bound. It got popular in the 70s when Martin Gardner wrote about it in Scientific American. It's a rather iconic huge number, and on a scale that grows like f omega plus 1, it sits in a reasonable spot. Now, the cycle count of my Opus Magnum machine breaks this scale too. Let's build the scale for f omega plus 2. We have definitions for all of the numbers g0, g1, g2, and so on. This basically defines a function g that we can iterate. So on the new scale, the first interval starts at g0 and ends at g0. The next interval goes from that to g0. Now, because g0 is just 4, and Graham's number is g64, Graham's number lives right here. It's just barely imperceptibly past the start of the second interval. This scale is the one that is correct for talking about the cycle count of my machine. My machine makes 6 outputs. The first output happens on cycle 3795. All things considered, a very small number. That would be something like here, basically the start of the 0 interval. The second output happens basically at the start of the next interval, still less than Graham's number. The third output happens in the next interval over. By the time it makes 6 outputs, we're over here. And the 6th output is the cycle count, so the cycle count of my machine is definitely bigger than Graham's number, because my machine is computing a function that grows like f omega plus 2. Okay, let's take a look at this machine. Everything above the track is an Ackermann function calculator. The stack is kept over here on the left. In the middle, this is where it checks the front two values of the list and it chooses the appropriate condition. The hardest part, which is when we're actually in the third condition and we have to copy a number, happens over here on the right. Copy is kind of interesting, because the loop that the ARM is obeying has only 336 instructions. If I have to copy a number that's 10,000 or larger, I would need to separately grab 10,000 different waters and line them up. That can only be done using multiple loops of the tape. So every copy happens across many loops of the tape. One loop at a time, it'll first bring the number being copied slowly down until it reaches the end. Then one loop at a time, it builds it back up. This is what was going on for most of the ASMR video from before. This has implications for the rest of the instructions, though. There has to be something on the board to tell the ARM whether a copy is in progress or not. If a copy is in progress, you don't want to grab two values or do really anything except just progress the copy. And if I pause the tape right at the first instruction, you see the signal lives right here on this bonder. Whenever there's something on the right, the bonder is empty. If the right is empty, the bonder ends up with an atom. By holding this atom, the ARM can only pull two values off of the stack when it's appropriate to do so. By the way, you might have noticed that this first instruction never grabs anything. There's nothing here to grab. To explain this instruction, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. You see, Opus Magnum doesn't have a loop from here command. If I want to start the machine by doing one thing, those instructions still run every loop. And this sort of machine needs a starting point. So on the first loop, the ARM isn't over there on the left, it's right here, grabbing the water. It builds its first stick 3 water atoms long, and then it does a bunch of minus instructions. These 3 water atoms are built one time because of the location of the ARM. All of the minus instructions guarantee that the ARM performs this next grab from the same place on every loop. So what happens when it finishes computing the Ackermann function? When this happens, there will be only one value in the list, which means no bonds keep things connected when it passes over this glyph right here. Once you account for every atom, you end up with one stick of atoms with length equal to the result, 2 extra atoms that go below the track, and whatever waste has been accumulating in the lower right. This is the only occasion where the ARM is holding anything during this section of the tape. We'll talk about what it's doing soon, but I want to focus first on what happens to the stick of atoms, because it's at this point where that 3-atom stick we built on the first loop fits in. The original stick and all sticks that come from complete computations are sent right back into the copy station. Specifically, the machine takes the stick, copies it, subtracts 1, and then pushes those 2 values to start a new list. We are back in action. Ignore me. Remembering that everything is 1 bigger because we need to be able to encode 0, the very first stack says to compute Ackermann function of 1 and 2. The answer to this is 4. On cycle 3700-ish, we end up with the 2 things we promised, stick of 4 atoms and 2 more below the track, and the 19 extra atoms in the other chain. Before outputting, the machine uses the output to move those 19 atoms over by 1 column. That'll be interesting very soon. Next, accounting for our encoding and the subtraction, the machine must compute Ackermann function of 2 and 3, which is 9. How kind to stay on low numbers for now. This completes at around cycle 27,600, and we can watch as it takes these atoms below. Now we see the purpose of those 19 extra atoms. We don't make an output. We just cancel out one of the 19 atoms. 18 more remain. We won't make an output again until this is cleared out all the way down to 0. Okay, well, what's the next computation? It's going to be Ackermann function of 7 and 8. Well, that number is too big to write in the universe. It's a 5-up arrow number, fitting nicely in the 5th interval of the omega scale, or finally earning us a spot on the omega +1 scale where we met Graham's number. At this point, we can watch the machine make progress, but we won't live to see the conclusion. We have to go on theory alone. But if you trust that I've gotten the theory right, then at some distant point in the future, the stack will be reduced to a single stick of some 5-up number of atoms, and we will finally then turn 18 down in the bottom into 17. This bonder over here in the lower left will activate for the very first time. Next, the machine must compute the Ackermann function of two 5-up numbers. That answer breaks the omega scale and moves us over one spot on the omega plus 1 scale. After 17 more moves like this, we finally make our second output. Just like before, when it makes the second output, it moves the atoms in the other chain over by one column. So next we have to figure out how many atoms are there anyway. Well, with the exception of the very first loop where it grabs extra at the start, each time the arm completes the tape loop, it adds 2 water to the board somewhere. Either one of them gets added to the stack and one of them gets added to the waste chain, or both get added to the waste chain. Those are the only options, which means that no matter what, after a computation finishes, the chain will be longer than the result. We saw that earlier. When it made the result 4, there were 19 atoms in the chain. When we make the second output, our result is something like G18. There are at least that many atoms in the chain. And so before we can make our third output, we need to iterate the Ackermann function that many more times. Iterating the Ackermann function G18 times takes us a step over by one interval in the omega plus 2 picture. And of course, by the time we are done and have made that result, which looks like G of 18, there's around that many atoms in the chain that need to be counted off one by one before we can make our fourth output. Now, of course, we can't ever see its cycle score. Long before it even makes its second output, the game will crash. And not a cool crash like in classic Tetris, or even a normal Opus Magnum crash where 2 atoms run into each other. Instead, it's the kind of crash that happens when there's not enough memory in your computer to store the positions of all the atoms. So I have to hope that my theoretical analysis holds up, which I think it does. I'd like to give a big thanks to Luna and Mr. Puzzle for developing a mod framework for Opus Magnum and building mods that let me run this game at such a fast speed. I'd also like to shout out the upcoming Opus Magnum tournament. Each January through April or so, there's an event with custom puzzles. You can check it out at the link on your screen. This year's host is Zorflax, and he promises not to make anyone do computation. These will just be ordinary puzzles, and don't worry, I like those too. Now let's watch more of the Opus Magnum computation ASMR, this time with a better understanding of what it's doing. Thanks, and see you next time.